Reality of Aid Asia Pacific is an independent regional organization representing over 80 civil society organizations working on aid and development cooperation. We are governed by a steering committee with representatives from Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, Middle East, and North Africa and the Pacific. We monitor the management of aid and its impacts to the marginalized and vulnerable. We strengthen the technical and leadership capacities of CSOs through trainings, dialogues, and advocacy campaigns. We engage donors, policymakers, and other development actors to assert rights-based, people-centered sustainable development. Be part of Reality of Aid Asia Pacific. Visit www.realityofaid.org to learn more about our work and advocacies.
The CSO Partnership for Development Effectiveness is an open platform that unites CSOs from around the world on the issue of effective development cooperation. Effective development cooperation is a framework in achieving real inclusive development by ensuring an enabling environment for all development stakeholders. It puts forward development that upholds human rights, decent work, gender equality, environmental sustainability, among others. CPDE strives to make development more effective by reshaping how global aid is done and empowering CSOs to play a large role in development work.
CPDE hopes to be able to address the issues of human rights, people's rights, people's participation in governance, in decision-making, in democracy. And we hope to achieve this by collaboration, cooperation, or solidarity with different stakeholders and actors like government and certain private sectors.
CPDE brings together CSOs to work in various advocacy arenas. For many years, civil society has been pushing for genuine solutions to address worsening poverty and inequality. These efforts have resulted in the formulation of commitments and principles of effective development cooperation in 2012. Since then, the CPDE has promoted the EDC. One of the main goals of CPDE is to universalize EDC, which means applying the framework to all development programs to ensure that the symptoms and structural causes of poverty and inequality are addressed.
La cooperación eficaz es importante porque en general mucha cooperación viene por parte de los gobiernos. Sin embargo, para que esa cooperación sea transversal y sea participativa y democrática, la sociedad civil no solo tiene que estar en el momento del diseño de la cooperación, sino también en el momento de la implementación, en el momento del monitoreo, para poder hacer lo que llamamos apropiación democrática, y es que las sociedades que reciben esa cooperación se sientan parte, involucradas con los procesos de cooperación y que realmente sea sustentable, es decir, que a largo plazo esas sociedades puedan subsistir y puedan desarrollarse, desarrollar su industria, desarrollar su sociedad, desarrollar sus derechos sin la necesidad de una cooperación internacional.
CPDE members are located in 117 countries across 7 regions. CPDE convenes 8 major sectors: agriculture and rural development, feminist groups, faith-based organizations, indigenous peoples, international civil society, labor, migrants in diaspora, youth.
Over the past 10 years, we have seen that civil society organizations, their trade unions, women's organizations, youth organizations, farmers organizations, are increasingly being oppressed by governments and vested interests. And our biggest achievement is to consistently bring this issue into discussions about development aid and development effectiveness.
Join us, and together, let us embark on the journey towards effective development cooperation. To know more about our work, visit our website at www.csopartnership.org and follow our social media accounts.
Reality of Aid Asia Pacific is an independent regional organization representing over 80 civil society organizations working on aid and development cooperation. We are governed by a steering committee with representatives from Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, Middle East, and North Africa and the Pacific. We monitor the management of aid and its impacts to the marginalized and vulnerable. We strengthen the technical and leadership capacities of CSOs through trainings, dialogues, and advocacy campaigns. We engage donors, policymakers, and other development actors to assert rights-based, people-centered sustainable development. Be part of Reality of Aid Asia Pacific. Visit www.realityofaid.org to learn more about our work and advocacies.
The CSO Partnership for Development Effectiveness is an open platform that unites CSOs from around the world on the issue of effective development cooperation. Effective development cooperation is a framework in achieving real inclusive development by ensuring an enabling environment for all development stakeholders. It puts forward development that upholds human rights, decent work, gender equality, environmental sustainability, among others. CPDE strives to make development more effective by reshaping how global aid is done and empowering CSOs to play a large role in development work.
CPDE hopes to be able to address the issues of human rights, people's participation in governance, in decision-making, in democracy. And we hope to achieve this by collaboration, cooperation, or solidarity with different stakeholders and actors like government and certain private sectors.
CPDE brings together CSOs to work in various advocacy arenas. For many years, civil society has been pushing for genuine solutions to address worsening poverty and inequality. These efforts have resulted in the formulation of commitments and principles of effective development cooperation in 2012. Since then, the CPDE has promoted the EDC. One of the main goals of CPDE is to universalize EDC, which means applying the framework to all development programs to ensure that the symptoms and structural causes of poverty and inequality are addressed.
La cooperación eficaz es importante porque en general mucha cooperación viene por parte de los gobiernos. Sin embargo, para que esa cooperación sea transversal y sea participativa y democrática, la sociedad civil no solo tiene que estar en el momento del diseño de la cooperación, sino también en el momento de la implementación, en el momento del monitoreo, para poder hacer lo que llamamos apropiación democrática. Y es que las sociedades que reciben esa cooperación se sientan parte, involucradas con los procesos de cooperación y que realmente sea sustentable, es decir, que a largo plazo esas sociedades puedan subsistir y puedan desarrollarse, desarrollar su industria, desarrollar su sociedad, desarrollar sus derechos sin la necesidad de una cooperación internacional.
CPDE members are located in 117 countries across 7 regions. CPDE convenes 8 major sectors: agriculture and rural development, feminist groups, faith-based organizations, indigenous peoples, international civil society, labor, migrants in diaspora, youth.
Over the past 10 years, we have seen that civil society organizations, their trade unions, women's organizations, youth organizations, farmers organizations, are increasingly being oppressed by governments and vested interests. And our biggest achievement is to consistently bring this issue into discussions about development aid and development effectiveness.
Join us, and together, let us embark on the journey towards effective development cooperation. To know more about our work, visit our website at www.csopartnership.org and follow our social media accounts.
A jam-packed program, and we hope that we all can stay until the very end. So, can we do the next slide? Just quick reminders for those who want to avail the interpretation. We have them in 4 languages, of course, English. We also have in French, Spanish, and Arabic. So just click the button where you want to hear your desired language. So our interpreters are ready, are now ready. It's also advisable that you click the mute original audio so we don't hear each other simultaneously. And of course, these other reminders, please be cautious when you are muting and unmuting your microphone so we don't interrupt the presenter. For other greetings, tech concerns, and questions, please use the chat box to reach out to the organizers and to the other participants. And it would also be beneficial for everyone if you can please rename your Zoom ID, not to indicate your name and your organization, where you're from. So we're all familiar with each other. And on that note, I am Sarah Torres, the coordinator of Reality of Aid Asia Pacific. And with me is Diwa de la Cruz from the IPMSDL and the CPDE Working Group on Conflict and Fragility. So later on, you will see Diwa to moderate the panel discussion. All right. So just a quick program run through. So today we'll be joined by Ms. Beverly Longid, co-chair of CPDE, and also the global coordinator of IPMSDL, to share the welcoming remarks for this launch. After that, Diwa will facilitate our panel discussion. We actually have 3 panels for today. The 3 panels are according to the vision of our Nexus research. One panel is on gender, the second panel is on environment and climate, and the third is on development and migration. And after those panel discussions, we will be joined by INCAF and SIDA as reactors to our panel discussions. So we have for the first panel, Rosabel from CEIM. We have Charles from iWatch as a doula from Scholarship for Afghanistan. Rosabel is from Spain, but her case study is on Mali. Charles is from Cameroon. We also have a representative from Katribo, grassroots organization in the Philippines. Luis from Guatemala, from Tsukimpop, and Maggie from Sayof SADC from Southern Africa. And we also have Elle from APN from Syria. Yes, from Syria. And then Masum from CDP in Bangladesh. And lastly, Leo Anij from Nigeria. So we're in a global scope today. And we're happy again to be joined by all of our contributors, and our reactors. So just a quick background. This research is I think more than a year in the making. So we started early 2020 developing the concept note, selecting contributors, and finalizing the outputs, the case studies or the country contexts of this research. And why Nexus? For Reality of Aid Asia Pacific, it is one of our main thematic areas since last year and probably for the years to come. And it's also one of the thematic areas of the Conflict and Fragility Working Group. And I think in the welcoming remarks, Ms. Bev and also Diwa will be able to explain more on this. So I think we can start now. I'm a bit over time, but then now we can officially start our launch. So may I call on Ms. Beverly Longid, again, the CPDE co-chair and global coordinator of the IPMSDL, for the opening remarks. Over to you, Ms. Bev.
Greetings to all, and I welcome everyone to this meeting on behalf of the CPDE Task Force on Nexus Issues and the International Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation, as well as our co-organizer, the Reality of Aid Asia Pacific. The CPDE had its first study conference on the People Nexus in 2019 in Amman, Jordan, hosted by our dear colleagues in the Arab Group for the Protection of Nature and also one of the organizations contributing to this research. In that study conference, several key messages were formed on how we should harmonize the humanitarian, development, peace nexus with our aid effectiveness advocacy. Among those we've identified is the need for humanitarian, development, and peace actors to recognize the importance of addressing the structural determinants of humanitarian crisis, such as long-standing poverty, power relations, socioeconomic and gender inequalities, land and resource grabbing, and political violence and insecurity. The components of the triple nexus were never separate to begin with. It is simply not possible to have a sustainable solution in one of the components without addressing the other two, and vice versa. Addressing the root causes of the problem is a vital step in finding solutions that promote just and lasting peace, realize the right to development, and an end to humanitarian crisis, and thus eradicating the need for humanitarian aid, not only in situations of conflict and fragility, but in emergency situations due to disaster, climate change, and pandemics such as what we have now, such as what we are experiencing now. In cases of conflict and fragility, this applies to long-standing issues of Palestine, Syria, and West Papua, and even in the case of post-occupation Afghanistan. Another important thing that I'd like to note in that study conference is that the participants came from or had worked on the ground in countries in global regions experiencing conflict and fragility in its different shades and states. In fact, many had come from West Asia and North Africa region, also called as the Middle East and North Africa region. The region which for a long time had the most number of countries suffering from wars, occupations, and crises. I believe this is a very important thing in meetings like this. It ensures that our discussion is grounded to the realities of people living in conflict and fragility by having them speak on their own experience and recommendations. It also brings to light experiences often unheard, such as those of women, children, indigenous peoples, and the stateless peoples. This research is another form of this collective effort to ground the aid discourse and to propose concrete ways forward. The findings of this research are envisioned to assist in policy advocacy and policy development, especially in the context of the pandemic that exacerbates ongoing conflicts and states of fragility. For instance, the economic depression is being used as justification by many states and financial institutions to forward neoliberal policies that will further drown people in debt and crisis. I hope this research is hopeful in informing development actors and most of all, beneficial to the people in conflict and fragility. May we be seen not as helpless beings dependent on the benevolence of others, but rather active voices or able to speak up and take action in bringing about change towards a peaceful and just society. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the collaborating team of IPMSDL and Reality of Aid Asia Pacific, the research contributors, our team of editors, proofreaders, and artists for the layout and posters we've seen on social media, and the technical team on this program in Zoom. All of them made our event possible today. Thank you, and I look forward to listening to the succeeding speakers. We await the research being made available free to the public as contributing to the meaningful discussions on the triple nexus. Thank you, and warm greetings to all.
Really be used by us and other CSOs for their own engagements. And that's why we've invited, as I've mentioned earlier, NCAF, represented by Julia Codina Serios, and also SIDA, represented by Karina Saibano. I hope I pronounced that correctly. No, for a very productive dialogue later on. So before I turn over the floor to Diwa, just so you see the background I have, I will be linking on the chat box these advocacy posters, which you can use as background, or you can print it out later on. So when we do the wrap up before the closing remarks, we can have a good and nice photo op. So that is all. Over to you, Diwa. Diwa, you're on mute.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello again, everyone. Good evening from Manila. As Sarah mentioned, when the project started, the IPMSDL was the secretariat of the CPDE Working Group on Conflict and Fragility. But now the CPDE has actually identified priority engagements, and one of them is the triple nexus, a relatively new concept in the aid discourse. So in the process of restructuring inside the CPDE, the Working Group on Conflict and Fragility is now actually a task force on the nexus issues. And many of the contributors in this research are part of that task force. So that's it for the short introduction and background. For the presentations, as Sarah said, we will doing it in panels of 3. Our researchers have been grouped according to similar themes or themes that are relatively alike. They'll be sharing with us an overview of their study, findings from the assessment of development, humanitarian, and or peace programs or policies in their respective contexts, and the feasibility of transforming this into a Nexus project if it wasn't originally designed as one. So the recommendations that they will also be sharing will cover what needs to be done to address the root cause of the conflict as how they identified it in their research, or how the project can be, or program that they evaluated could contribute to peace building. So I think at this point, it is already worth emphasizing that when we talk of peace, it's not simply the absence of violence, short-term violence, but one that is lasting and just. So moving on to the first panel, we begin with these set of researchers who have studies that focus on gender and youth rights in situations of conflict. So actually, none of them are joining us live. We have a video presentation recorded earlier by Rosabel, the director of Centro de Estudios e Investigación sobre Mujeres, or the Center for Women's Research and Studies. She conducts consultancy, feminist research, and advocacy around women's rights. Her contribution to this publication is an evaluation of the early warning system on gender-based violence in conflict settings as it was used in the situation of armed conflict in Mali. So Rosabel's video will be played later on. And following that, I will be giving the overviews for the studies of Charles Linjap of Investment Watch from Cameroon and Asadullah Mohammadi from the Scholarship for Afghanistan. So as we are all aware, there is actually the issue in Afghanistan is one recent development in the conflict and fragility. So it is worth noting that in this research also our editor has added a postscript to Asadullah's contribution, and we can get to that later. So for now, let us watch Rosabel's presentation, and then I will follow with some background on Charles and Asadullah's contributions.
Entendemos que resultaba fundamental incluir en ese análisis de casos una visión feminista de los conflictos. Esta mirada feminista promueve un enfoque integral de desarrollo integral y concertado en la violencia y los derechos de las mujeres y niñas,
approach
que nos
in
permita abordar las
regarding the
necesidades humanitarias
human rights of
con
women
enfoques
and
a largo plazo,
girls,
centrados en el empoderamiento
allowing
de los
us
derechos
to
humanos,
address
que posibiliten reducir la
needs with a
vulnerabilidad, la
long-term
pobreza,
approach centered on human rights so as to reduce insecurity, poverty in the framework of this concept of human security, and also to put emphasis on the structural inequality levels affecting most especially to women and girls, thus promoting peace and social justice. This case that we want to share today is presented we here present an instrument that is a result of a process called Early Warning System on Gender-Based Violence in Conflict Settings, elaborated and managed by the ONG called Women in Conflict Zones, with the acronym MZZ, in Mali. The main aims of this instrument is to identify different levels of violation of human rights, threats, as well as resources and action capacities of the population on the one hand, and on the other hand, to improve the intervention by women in conflict zones, thus contributing to the struggle against gender inequality in armed conflict contexts. We believe that this is consistent with the triple nexus proposals for different reasons. First of all, this in armed conflict context. Instruments embraces and commits with this feminist approach of conflicts in line with the frameworks of the CEDAW, the Declaration and the Action Platform of Beijing, the Istanbul Convention, and the Women, Peace and Security Agenda that put emphasis on the key elements that feminists need to take into account in any type of participation, of intervention, active participation of women and girls in the prevention, management, and resolution of conflicts, respect for human rights, and suppression of all types of violence against women and girls, both in the private and the public spheres. The ultimate goal is to promote a life free of violence and contributing to the end of impunity by establishing more equal and just and fair societies. On the other hand, it allows to identify the urgent needs derived from humanitarian emergencies with a long-term approach aimed at reducing vulnerability and risks faced by women and girls. And this allows us to tackle the causes of violence against them, so that with this we contribute to fostering peace and social justice. Regarding implementation, we see that, generally speaking, in this humanitarian context, there is a great divide that derives by the lack of real will on the part of the governments and international bodies, that is reflected in the lack of resources and funding for projects and programs with this integrated feminist approach in humanitarian context. I'll give you an example. This project that is fully funded by the NGO that is promoted it in the light of difficulties and the lack of interest it found among the Spanish official donors. I'm going to explain how this instrument works. It includes indicators that are regularly feeded by local informants. They allow us to identify needs, real on-the-ground needs, putting a special emphasis and attention on the different needs of human protection and security. This way, we make a mapping of the different levels of threats, risks, and vulneration or violation of rights on the ground, among them sexual violence, sexual assaults. With this information, we contribute to increase the efficiency of interventions that will be designed by our agency or entities so as to meet these identified needs. We need to cover the most immediate needs by women, girls, and other excluded groups such as the Bela ethnic group, and we want to address the structural, political, cultural, and socio-economic conditions that make these groups be subjected to violence and discrimination. One of the main challenges and aspects we need to improve is the need to update regularly these indicators so as to include new realities such as the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, indicators related to the identification and management of human trafficking situation, thus including the number 38 general recommendation of the CDAU, indicators related to reduction of civic spaces in line with the Istanbul principles or hate speeches, or the increase in the number of fundamentalist and extremist movements in the region. This instrument just presented is accompanied by training and awareness raising actions, not only by key informants, but also promoted by society as a whole. So during its implementation, we identified an increase in sexual exploitation practices in the form of prostitution within the villages and action areas, and also in growth in the number of Mali women that are victims of human trafficking in transit countries towards Europe. So with all these data, with all that information we collected, we launched specific campaigns together with women, girls, and village authorities so as to eradicate these forms of violence, sexual exploitation. And this made possible to launch other campaigns to eradicate practices that are getting worse as a result of the conflict, such as female genital ablation and early forced marriages. However, despite all the successes and the accomplishments, there is a long way to go to finally eradicate these types of violence, not only due to the prevailing impunity, but the lack of effectiveness of national authorities in the internal conflict context. So in this framework, the procedures to report, research, and denounce human rights violations in a context of failed states such as Mali is a difficult to solve challenge. That's all. Thank you for your attention.
Right. Thank you. That was Rosabel's presentation of her contribution. And as mentioned earlier, I will be giving the overview of Charles and Asadula's topics. So Charles Linjak, one of our contributors from Investment Watch in Cameroon, also he is one of our two contributors who focused on the conflict in Lake Chad related to the Boko Haram conflict. So Charles actually focused his study in Cameroon, evaluating the use of hard power or the military security actions to terrorism by the Cameroon government, noting the impact of these on women and children in conflict situation. So he situated the gender-based violence in the terrorist activities carried out by the terrorist group Boko Haram and evaluated the multinational Joint Task Force or MNJTF, a donor-supported military security response to the conflict in relation to the issue. Charles showed that in the case of Boko Haram in Cameroon, development and humanitarian actions were historically downplayed in favor of military security actions funded by France, US, UK, and other donors against the organization, while the latter, including the MNJTF, is necessary. Development and humanitarian actions can and must be undertaken immediately and in tandem with the security actions. But at the same time, he recommends human rights training and abuse monitoring in order to make the task force compliant with international humanitarian law and African Union standards. He also mentions the problems brought about by the one-sided focus on military security responses to the conflict, including the emergence of dictatorships, armed conflict, and the proliferation of illicit weapons. Complicated by the lack of transparency, military assistance is suspected of being used by the Cameroonian government to suppress the civilian uprising in English-speaking parts of the country. Furthermore, refusal to address the root cause of the conflict only further increases the need for humanitarian actions. Charles' study also forward a project that will rebuild communities and provide jobs to women and the youth. And this is the labor-intensive approach dubbed as the HMMO model, promoted by the AFD, or the Agence Français de Development. While this can be helpful in the short and immediate term, long-term development paths should be explored. So Charles recommends that the involvement of women in peace-building efforts. He also presents in development the problems in development cooperation in financing in Africa. So one is the difference between the pledges and the actual delivery. The two is fragmented donor financing that lacks transparency and accountability. Three is unreliable timing. And four is the centrality of donor preferences to regional organizations. The program he evaluated exhibits country ownership, although it is long-term interest of the country that development actions be included, even prioritized in relation to peace and security projects. The results are positive, even crucial, but do not suffice to solve the cause of the conflict, especially the social and economic crisis. There are no inclusive partnerships, especially with civil society organizations, and there is no transparency and accountability, and there are even areas where mismanagement can be inferred. So that is a brief summary of actually, it's already part of the conclusion and recommendations of Charles's research. So for Asadula's contribution on Afghanistan, as mentioned, he is from the Scholarship of Afghanistan, and his project is an evaluation of three World Bank funded education programs in Afghanistan in relation to how it is able to respond to immediate needs of the youth affected by conflict who are unable to access education, and at the same time how this contributes to long-term peace building in the country. So he shows how the projects brought about developments in the education sector even as the country is still facing conflicts with the Taliban. So note that this was written prior to the so-called fall of Kabul. And the enrollments of students has increased. The number of teachers trained for schools has also increased. Many school teachers and principals have been trained in school management, and all of these have resulted in an increase in literacy levels. Schools for technical vocational education have also been established, and the number of enrollees in the schools has increased. Most notable in all these advances is a focus on and improvements in gender equality. So our researcher enumerates the ways that the projects can further be developed: improving quality, teacher qualifications, geographical distribution, parent and childhood education with specialized education. At the same time, he raises important questions about the development path which the current education in Afghanistan is taking. So although we note the ability of these projects to meet the short-term needs or the immediate needs for education, he says that the World Bank embodies the dominant development visions and strategies, but alternative ones can still be discussed. He asserts that education should not foreclose the discussions have been concluded, but should open up. With regard to the triple nexus discourse, the World Bank education projects in Afghanistan are more concentrated on the development pillar, bringing about steps in the direction of the development of the country. But however, it needs to be examined carefully to see their capacity in the long run and bringing about genuine development and addressing the root causes of the conflict. So development projects in this case follow the dominant development vision and strategies, must be examined in the light of the vision and strategies of people-centered and sustainable development. There is country ownership of the World Bank programs on education that were evaluated in the paper, even as it raises questions about how the program serves the long-term interest of the country. The program's results are clear and positive, but must be evaluated with regard to the country's interests in attaining people-centered and sustainable development. Inclusive partnerships were built in relation to the program, especially with the involvement of community shuras. So this is a form of decision-making on a community level that are traditionally practiced in the countries. And thus, transparency and accountability were observed in the program. So that's those are the summary of the findings for our first set of research contributors who have the common theme of gender and youth rights. They highlighted basically the lack of accessibility of social services, especially for the youth, such as employment opportunities and education, as a significant driver to the conflict, or the role of the lack of accessibility to this in maintaining a nation state of fragility. Digging deeper, it's not just the accessibility per se of the social services, but also the character and quality of these services with respect to how it actually contributes to the long-term needs of the country for development building. And just a side note, again, in the publication, the editor has written a postscript for the Afghanistan article in relation to the World Bank expressing that it will stop providing aid to the country since the rise of the Taliban to power. So it would be good to take a look into this, as it provides an additional evaluation of the World Bank's development projects in the country in retrospect. So moving on to our second panel. We have research contributions touching on the theme of violated indigenous people's rights and exacerbated environmental and climate issues under situations of conflict. So first, we have Ricky Gono from Kabataan para sa Tribong Pilipino, or Katribu Youth, national organizations of students and youth in the Philippines dedicated to the assertion of the rights of indigenous peoples, and they also provide support to indigenous peoples' organizations and communities in their campaign for social equality, genuine freedom, and democracy. Following Ricky is Jose Luis Sigil Lopez from Guatemala, representing Movimiento Tzukimpop, an organization that works towards the development of a just, dignified, and democratic society. And completing this panel is Maggie Muape, a young environmentalist and also the regional co-chairperson of the Southern Africa Youth Forum, a regional development platform for the youth and youth organization in the Southern African development community that works to empower young people and ensure sustainable inclusion. So let's start with Ricky, who has also sent a recorded video earlier, and then Jose and Maggie, who will come in to present live.
Good day, everyone. I am Ricky, and I will be briefly talking about our research entitled Dancing about our indigenous and Thai communities in the Philippines. One of the central premises of the Triple Nexus discourse is the necessity in conflict situations to go beyond actions intended to save lives, alleviate immediate suffering, and maintain human dignity. Beyond that, it calls for genuine efforts to address the root causes of conflicts, primarily through various forms of development action, and secondarily through actions geared towards a long-term and lasting peace. This paper seeks to add nuance to such discourse by assessing development actions that do not address the root causes of existing conflicts, but instead exacerbate them, especially in terms of their families in the field of development and in causing escalating human rights violations. Historically, the IPs retained their relative independence during the Spanish colonization by defending their territories. The Spaniards robbed natives of their land under the encomienda system and converted land to produce export-oriented goods on haciendas. Remnants of this system have persisted to the present day through practices such as converting communal ancestral lands into individually titled private lands and dams, among others. After the Spanish colonization, bureaucratic processes were retained that enabled the displacement of IPs by megadams for the production of electricity, to provide irrigation services, and establish flood control. Most of the dams under evaluation were built on indigenous peoples' lands. These lands are where the IPs have dedicated their lives to preserving their culture and protecting the environment. Dams, just like any development project, should not be constructed without free, prior, and informed consent from the affected indigenous communities. It is a form of contract which imposes an ethical requirement for genuine consultation before an agreement can be reached between the developer or contractor and the affected population. An FPIC protects the indigenous people's right to the ancestral lands from development aggression and other forms of plunder, and hence should be genuinely secured. According to human rights groups in the Philippines, these human rights violations were carried out within the framework of the Duterte government's Executive Order 70, or the whole-of-nation approach. It is a counterinsurgency program which uses at least 18 major government agencies to join the campaign to criminalize dissent. In conclusion, large-scale dams in the Philippines are touted as projects that will address the water supply shortage, especially in the country's capital, and contribute to the national development. These projects are jointly implemented by governments, concerned agencies, multinational corporations, and international financial institutions engaged in public-private partnerships. However, especially those revealed in the course of project implementation, show that the adverse and even disastrous effects of these development partnerships, not only in the country's IPs, but on the Filipino people in general. After all, these projects hinder long-term development, peace, and humanitarian goals. Indeed, large-scale dam projects have become a new scheme and a system of grabbing IP lands in wanton disregard of the alternatives being proffered by various sectors of society. At the same time, IP's resistance to these development projects are met with severe repression from the government and the military, further fueling existing conflict. Counterinsurgency is often used as a convenient excuse to push through with large-scale dam projects to the detriment of the rights and lives of IPs, who are themselves red tagged and labeled as communist terrorists if they oppose the dams. In summary, the dam projects will not bring genuine development or peace to the people of the Philippines, indigenous or not, as these are rooted in the plunder of lands and wanton disregard for IP's basic right to free, prior, and informed consent and self-determination. While these dam projects idealize the concept of development cooperation, they fail to uphold the basic principle of do no harm, and more importantly, that of the triple nexus approach that emphasizes solving the root causes of conflict through people-centered development action. With the effects of the large-scale dam projects on indigenous peoples and the worsening of human rights violations that they bring about, the researchers recommend that the government evaluate development projects in ways that uphold IP's basic rights, are sustainable, and do no harm to IP communities and the Filipino people. Key recommendations arising from this research include a moratorium, rehabilitation of previously built dams, alternative water sources, and the continued demand for justice for those accountable for the numerous human rights violations. Thank you and have a good day. Thank you and have a good day.
Luis, you may start.
Gracias. Bien, un saludo a todos.
Thank you so much. Greetings to everyone from Guatemala, the land of Guatemala. We have developed a study, a research Now, about the situation of triple nexus in Guatemala. Basically, we have said that Guatemala is a fragile state, and I would like to say some important things regarding the context in which we're living here now in Guatemala. Guatemala is a survivor. We have lived a civil war, a conflict during 36 years since 1996 that ended with the agreement, the peace agreement that started regarding the statement that there was an agreement to bring peace, long-lasting peace to the country. But we need to understand that this conflict left more than 200,000 deaths and 300,000 people that needed to seek for refugee in other regions. Guatemala nowadays has an IDH of 0.37, and it's one of the countries with the biggest number of infants dead. We're talking about 47%. Children are undernourished, and this affects life greatly. And therefore, we need to understand that this data is very well reflected, and has an indigenous face and affects women enormously. We need to take into account that in the last years, the civil society has been speaking. We have had problems accessing the lands, and we have had problems with the invasion of people extracting materials in our land, especially in the mining industry. Or sometimes there is big construction in the country. This has increased enormously, and monoculture has been a thing in our country, especially with sugar. This is generating a pressure in farmers, especially in indigenous territories that are very much affected by this problem. If we therefore understand the importance that this has, things like peace, development, and the pressure regarding emergencies in Guatemala, we don't know about triple nexus. The new government recognizes that even though there are different cooperation agencies, we don't have a coordination between the different parts, and this has a direct impact regarding the possibility to set out projects or give a orientation that is clearer regarding triple nexus. Some examples in humanitarian aid would be, for example, the Volcán de Fuego, the consequences that it brought, and there was a very late reply from the government. And not so long ago, last year, there were different hurricanes, and this had great consequences in Guatemala, but the government didn't have capacity to react. The different agencies, the government particularly, didn't give an answer. And on the other hand, there's the ability to develop ourselves. We have a national development plan, but it has not been able to coordinate efficiently with the general development approach of United Nations. And I would like to point out that people are going against against human rights defenders, different collectives as LGTB, etc. And this gives us some consequences. Guatemala has not been able to implement the coordination model. Furthermore, there is an important thing that the state, for example, right now is cut by economical big groups, and there is a corruption problem in the country. This has not allowed for the triple nexus to well establish, and this has different consequences in how things are developing. Lastly, I would like to say that recommendations that we are doing regarding the subject are calling society to gain this space, this civic space, this closed civic space from the government. And it's a call to the Guatemalan government to assume responsibilities of triple nexus in order for the aid to be more effective and the development to be more effective. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luis. Maggie, you may begin.
Okay. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Okay, thank you so much. So I will be sharing a PowerPoint presentation. Let me just share it. Okay. Can you? Okay. So my research was focusing on, from the Southern Africa Youth Forum, cyclone humanitarians and conflict in Mozambique. I'm the regional co-chair for the Southern Africa Youth Forum, and then also at national level, I'm working with the Center for Environment Justice.
Sorry, Maggie, excuse me. Could you play your presentation so that it can be in full screen? Play the slideshow.
Okay, sorry. Oh. Okay, please, how do I play it?
If you, yeah, you can try pressing F5. Maybe our tech team, Blaze, can help.
Please, yes. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so I think on this page, I was just trying to present how the triple nexus approaches, that is focusing on the humanitarian, peace and development. How do we achieve that, and why it is very important in the region. So you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So our case study was, why does it really talk about the triple nexus, and what was it trying to address? So firstly, this is to address the root causes of armed conflict. That would mean the development actions that would assist in bringing about significant peace and security, and make it easier for humanitarian actions to be performed in the future. And then secondly, to increase the significant humanitarian actions in the worst affected areas of Mozambique. That would mean as well increased budget allocation towards climate change actions and its consequences. The third part it was looking at is the challenges of reaching the most affected areas with disasters, such as cyclone due to the ongoing conflict in the areas of Mozambique. To be specific, the Cabo Delgado area, where it is difficult to access due to militia groups control. The fourth part, which was looking at the negative impacts of climate change, is now a growing reality for Mozambique, and this is because the country is frequently ravaged by natural disasters generated by hydrometeorological and also geophysical and biological processes. Then the last one, we're trying to look at how can we find solutions in addressing these issues now and the future, especially that we are very much aware of what is happening in Mozambique now. Next slide. Next slide, please. So what are we trying, how does it intervene into the triple nexus, our research paper? So you can, I'm sure you're aware that more than a year after the cyclone Idai landfill in April 2019, the humanitarian situation in Mozambique has deteriorated due to consecutive climate shocks, and then also public emergencies such as COVID-19 and cholera, and also issues to do with the growing insecurity in the country. Secondly, this has led to significant displacements of households and communities, also the disruption of livelihoods and lack of access to basic services such as healthcare, clean water, sanitation, as well as the protection services. As a result of the conflict which has been happening in Mozambique, approximately, let me say, an estimate of 176,000 people have lost access to their primary water sources due to the disruption of centralized water supply networks and also lack of access to safe and clean water. Hygiene facilities, those are some of the challenges that the country is facing. Lastly, in the community of Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, about 45% of health facilities lack access to water, while 85% of schools lack adequate hygiene facilities. This is what we found out from the research that we're undertaking. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So on this part was, what does the case study say about the implementation of triple nexus? The case study is recommending about 8 critical areas of considerations among them, and I will just share about 4 of them. The first thing that would really help in the implementation of the triple nexus, one, knowledge generation, the efficacy of triple nexus approach. This is where it is very important and crucial in dealing with the humanitarian situation in Mozambique. There is need to share enough information and analysis on this. And then secondly, strengthening the capacity for the SADC mediation. We have noticed in the past that, whenever there is issues to do with conflicts, it is very important that we address the security challenges. And specifically to Mozambique, this is very important. And also we have seen that also in DRC, we've had the same issues. So it's very important that SADC strengthens their mediation in dealing with conflict preparation, conflict prevention and resolution, and then also to come up with specific mechanisms in addressing issues like conflict as well as post-building. Most importantly, post-conflict reconstruction and development efforts. The third one is to address the SADC donor dependency syndrome. I think sometimes, of course, it is very important as a region and as SADC to have emergency resources to ourselves. Then every time we have a conflict or a disaster, we need to wait on the Western world to actually make donations for us. So I think it's important that we actually strengthen this, that we are able to raise resources within our region as much as we will get support from the other nations in dealing with security actions in the present conflict in Mozambique. Fourth, this is where we're talking about a greater involvement of civil society organizations. I think it's important to implement the triple nexus. The role of civil society must be very clear, and the platforms has to be created that we play our role in a very open engagement and ensure that we are part of the discussions in the implementation of the nexus. The last one is how do we enhance early warning systems for disaster preparedness? I think that is very important. There's a need for a SADC protocol on disaster risk management as guided by CEPO, scale up capacity building of communities and governments on climate issues. I think this is very important because it will help us to ensure access to information, effective management of natural resources, management of conflict, as well as human rights-based approach to good governance. The next slide. Thank you. So what are some of the actions that are needed to be done to address the root causes of conflict in Mozambique? So in order to restore peace and stability, we have identified a number of issues, or let me say actions for interventions during the research that bordering on the triple nexus elements. So the first one, restore security. This is very important and urgent. The government must prioritize the restoration of security in Cabo Delgado. There can be no development while there is conflict. So wherever there's a conflict, everything really comes to a standstill. So it's very important to restore peace and security. The second one, ensure training. This is because the Mozambican army forces require proper counter-agency training and logistical support to deal with local interest groups so that they could really address some of those challenges. And when you look at the ongoing with the United States having provided such kind of support, and also the European Union in supporting the same. The third point is we need to promote people-centered sustainable development in the region and the country. This is because poverty, landlessness, and joblessness are the root causes that push the Mozambican youth to join terrorist groups. You know, when young people do not have anything to do, they are able to fall for anything. So I think it's very important that we capacity build our young people with jobs or entrepreneurship activities so that they can not be and just stay out of political violence or just the terrorist groups that might entice them with little wages to go and join. And then the last part is how do we address the humanitarian crisis currently in Mozambique? The most interesting part in the research was that when you look at May 2021, when the G7 ministers had sat, they asked the Mozambican government to continue to work with the international community, that it's very challenging to actually push in more resources for humanitarian aid when the country is in conflict, because access becomes a challenge, engagement becomes a challenge, even coming up with brilliant ideas in addressing such issues. So the first priority is actually to address the conflicts so that peace and security is restored. Next slide. Thank you. So how have we evaluated this project in terms of the research? Firstly, one is to understand SADC is very active in terms of responding to regional conflicts, but I think we need to do more. And then also the implementation of the regional indicative strategy, and then also the CPO. That is very important, and also ensure that we are able to have transparent reports in terms of the implementation, evaluation, and the monitoring part. The other thing is many challenges hinder the attainment of SADC-directed programs on peace, security, and development. the lack of democratic governance in some SADC member states. This is very disturbing because we have seen too much rampant of corruption. We are also seeing issues where civil society are not able to participate freely. So there's something that needs to be done in terms of restricted participation of citizens and peace interventions. The last part is having an understanding of the rise of agency terrorism and rebel groups such as in Mozambique region and also DRC. I think these are some of the causes of concern that needs intervention. I thank you.
Okay, thank you to our second panel. Some takeaways. The need for humanitarian assistance is a phenomenon caused by conflict and fragility, but moreover, conflict also hinders the effective delivery of response to other urgent issues aside from the victims of the war itself, such as the victims of climate emergencies, which is the case for Mozambique. It becomes harder to deliver aid for other urgent issues. And it is crucial, these issues are crucial to address when looking into the country's long-term development. And crises and disasters like the climate issue, the volcanic eruptions, the typhoons, and now the pandemic are exposing the incoherence in the operations, as Luis emphasized, not only even among actors in the same pillar, particularly for development, leading to ineffective response to both short and long-term needs. These issues are not to be dismissed even in the context of armed conflict and the occupation, since the casualties arising from the poverty, the famine, the diseases, displacements, and disruptions in the productions for those in the rural areas match or even exceed the deaths from the direct killings for those caught in the crossfires. So going back to the cases of the Philippines and Guatemala, indigenous peoples, as they have presented, are among those that bear the heaviest burden or the brunt in the conflict. And in these fragile states, justice systems do not offer redress, but instead work as private mechanisms for a few. So it is quite worrisome that extractive projects are actually becoming the object of international cooperation funding, especially now that states are going into a frenzy trying to recover their economies, their depressed economies due to the pandemic. And since extractive projects are usually located in resource-rich indigenous territories and have been proven to be key drivers in humanitarian tragedy, such as dispossession and displacement, as well as environmental tragedies that become irreversible. I also appreciate what Maggie emphasized, how she appreciated the important role of civil society in in the Nexus approach, the power that civil society has in putting pressure for governments that have committed to international agreements and other human rights obligations with respect to upholding human rights and the humanitarian principles. So with that, it is also important that countries receiving aid or the recipient countries have developed or decisive national frameworks when it comes to humanitarian actions in order not to let donor interests become dominant. So that is also one of the things highlighted in the Guatemalan and the Mozambique cases. So again, thank you to our second panel. And moving on to our last panel, our last set of speakers shall present their research, which assess programs and policies concerning refugees in their respective contexts. So first we have Elle Ambler, the Research and Advocacy Officer of the Arab Group for the Protection of Nature, a grassroots organization dedicated to promoting food, resources, and political sovereignty in the Arab region. One of APN's main campaigns is the liberation of food systems and peoples from trade inequalities, wars, occupations, and sanctions. And actually one of their main campaigns is the Free Palestine campaign. Following Elle is Said Jahangir Hassan Masum, a human rights and development activist and executive director of the Coastal Development Partnership, a national research and advocacy focused nonprofit organization in Bangladesh. He's also the chairperson of the Reality of Aid Asia Pacific. And our last research contributor to present is Leo Atakpu, the Deputy Executive Director of the African Network for Environmental and Economic Justice and Chairman of the Board of Reality of Aid Africa. So Elle, you have the floor.
Thank you, Diwa. Let me just get set up with my presentation. All right, does that work?
Yes.
Wonderful. So, hi everyone. My paper looks at the European Union's response to the Syrian crisis. And it's a little bit different from some of the other papers presented, as it examines the entire response and not a single program. So I look at how the EU approaches aid to Syria and to the host countries where refugees have settled, and propose a shift in line with the triple nexus. I also look at how the nexus can help design programs that uphold development effectiveness principles in the difficult conditions found in Syria. So here we're looking at the division of around 24 billion euros of EU aid between host countries and Syria. My paper focuses on the response in Jordan, but similar arguments also apply to Lebanon and Turkey, where the majority of over 6 million Syrian refugees continue to live. The EU has a ban on reconstruction work in Syria writ large. This means that almost all aid directed there is humanitarian and mostly focused on short-term goals. This ban is supposed to bring political change to Syria that 10 years of fighting could not. As the EU is politically unwilling to support the conditions needed for return, it has focused efforts to funding host countries, as it also has stopped resettlement in Europe. And this aid to host countries has amounted to about 90% of total EU aid to the crisis. The funding to host countries also diverges in type from the funding that goes to Syria. While the EU speaks of operating under a humanitarian development nexus in Jordan, its work is dominated by development. It names employment generation as the key to answering refugees' needs, and has written policy to quote unquote end dependence on humanitarian assistance in existing displacement situations. My paper goes further into how the EU has pushed for neoliberal reforms in Jordan through this development response, even while its employment programs have faltered. So you see this stark division emerge between EU work in Syria and EU work in host countries, one dominated by humanitarian aid and the other by development. And of course, this is antithetical to the triple nexus approach. On one hand, it has contributed to unmet humanitarian needs, despite the enormous efforts of host countries. And on the other, it has contributed to protracted displacement and the continuation of dire crisis conditions inside of Syria. So the Syrian crisis has often been discussed as largely a refugee crisis, and this is perhaps as displacement most directly threatened to impact donor countries. However, by prescribing an examination of the points where peace building is needed, namely in reconciliation within and between Syrian communities, the triple nexus places resolving issues in Syria as a key focal point for an integrated strategy to address the entire crisis. Peace building, which is intimately related to root cause remediation, helps us see the scope of the crisis, in which displacement is one manifestation. In this way, the triple nexus serves as an orienting tool. The allocation of funding to development in Syria should lead to substantial and sustainable improvements to Syrians' quality of life, along with an opening to heal rifts between segments of the Syrian population. It can also be designed to address the concerns of the majority of refugees who still hope to return to Syria under improved conditions. The most common concerns cited by refugees who are considering returning include violence, conscription, and a lack of employment, services, and housing. These economic barriers provide a guide to development priorities, while the political barriers provide a guide to realistic concessions for the EU to leverage assistance against. Furthermore, even without development work in Syria, increasing numbers of Syrians are returning. The EU must work on the conditions they will face, rather than hold out for an unlikely political transition. So now it's important to note that my paper does not advocate that the EU cut budgets to host countries, but rather that it reckons with the magnitude of its responsibility in the crisis and direct funding to meet needs assessments over macroeconomic reform, rebalancing its development-heavy approach. The second half of my paper looks at how the triple nexus can navigate challenges to development effectiveness principles in Syria. Upholding a principle like inclusive partnerships runs into immense challenges due to actions taken by the Syrian government, EU member states, and others in a war that splintered Syrian society. The conjoining of humanitarian development and peacebuilding aid is the only way to work towards such goals. The social cohesion necessary for equitable policy will not form if Syrians continue to live in destitution, while donors wait for an inclusive form of politics to emerge. So neither peacebuilding nor development can go on in the other's absence. Indeed, development can open channels for urgently needed reconciliation. In my paper, I focus on agricultural reconstruction and give some ideas for types of projects that affect both a wide swath of Syrians and require collaboration between social factions, including large-scale infrastructural repair. I also argue for an incremental approach that realizes that each of these development effectiveness principles rely on the others and on a modicum of working trust between donors, the Syrian government, and the Syrian people. I also just want to briefly mention the role of sanctions in this. US sanction policy restricts both US and non-US actions in Syria. This limits the ability of the EU to aid reconstruction, along with exacting a catastrophic toll on Syria's economy, along with those of host countries, particularly Lebanon. So if we consider the refugee crisis as a component of the crisis at large, we can see how ending these sanctions is key to a coordinated assistance response, which also cares for the needs of host countries. Opposition to these forms of sanction remains a key priority for all of us interested in applying the triple nexus to conflict areas. So my major recommendations include a balancing of the types of assistance to host countries into Syria, coordination between these responses, which the UN is starting to implement, a development focus on needs assessments rather than macroeconomic reform, and building peace through broad-reaching development projects. And this case shows us not to be placated by the use of Nexus language in one part of the crisis, here the refugee crisis, but to evaluate funders' entire strategies through the lens of the triple nexus. This lens is perhaps particularly important in the context of refugee crises, as the split strategy between humanitarian aid and development aid that I outlined is likely to expand, as wealthy countries turn to sanctions as a dominant form of warfare, fail to reform their immigration policies, and continue to see economic incentives in development work. Ultimately, the EU bears responsibility to aid those living in Syria and to aid refugees who choose to stay in host countries, to return, or to move to a third country. The EU can fulfill this responsibility by increasing its humanitarian aid to host countries, reducing immigration barriers to Europe, and initiating large-scale reconstruction inside of Syria. Thank you.
Thank you, Elle. Masoom, please go on.
Thank you. So, my research was basically mapping the development effectiveness of the triple nexus approach in refugee context. And this research is quite unique in a context that the approach was tested in a developing country context. Here, the host country is a developing country. And also the research focuses on host community and refugee relationships. Next, please. So the study basically tried to develop the context. I will not go in details, but I will summarize the key points here. Basically, currently, more than 1 million Rohingya refugees are living in Cox's Bazar districts of Bangladesh. And these refugees now cover more than 1/3 of the district's population. And why these refugees are here? And we find that the targeted military crackdown and communal violence driven by military endorsed Buddhist fundamentalism in Myanmar. So things like that religion and militarism, religious fundamentalism and militarism has a key role in this kind of refugee context. And also there is a geopolitical interest. For example, China and India, they don't go along together, but in this Rohingya refugee context, they took the side of the Myanmar government. And we found because there is a huge economic interest there. And another interesting point is when the refugees first arrived in Bangladesh in 2017, it was the host community who was the first responder, not even the local government or the donors. Next, please. Next slide, please. So which program basically we try to map. The study examines the joint response plan for Rohingya humanitarian crisis. Though it was not officially declared kind of a Nexus program before 2020. And it started mainly as a single Nexus, I would say, because only humanitarian intervention. And now it could be considered as a double Nexus because it has both humanitarian and development intervention. Next, please. So we try to map the GRP-RSC or the Rohingya Nexus program in the context of development effectiveness principles. So we used relevance and country ownership, effectiveness, and also efficiency, development impact, and sustainability. So we found that country ownership is a very important in any protracted refugee crisis situation, especially in developing country context. And our study found that the country ownership is loosening. Bangladesh has moved from refugee-friendly approach in 2017 to refugee-avoiding approach in 2020. And Bangladesh recently declared that it will not accept any new Rohingya refugees. As I said before, that the host community was the first responder, but gradually, as they see that refugee will stay longer time, there is a hostile attitude growing among the host communities towards the refugees. And one key reason is they believe that refugees are getting better treatment from the government and international agencies. And also, we found that government and host community consider that refugees is relevant only for UN agencies, national NGOs, and INGOs because it benefits these organizations. In the context of effectiveness, we found that government and donor priorities are not properly aligned for the desired outcome of the Rohingya refugee crisis. So this lack of alignment is reducing the effectiveness. But our study found that although there are many gaps and weaknesses in the GRP-RSC program, this Nexus program is still the only effective multi-sectoral emergency humanitarian response mechanism currently available to provide life-saving and emergency services for the Rohingya refugees. Next, please. In the context of efficiency, we found that although there are a large number of organizations, more than 100 organizations involved in this GRP-RSC implementation, the process is fairly efficient. However, the absence of peace component has reduced the efficiency of the Nexus program. Besides, the lack of required finance is also a key challenge for improving the efficiency of the Nexus program. Development impact, although this is fairly a very short time, we cannot map the development impact in such a short time. But we found this Nexus program is the only option currently available for the survival of the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. Despite many challenges and gaps, the program has been satisfying 60 to 70% of the current emergency need. But it has different development impact as well. We found that the market inflation is getting high because of the presence of large number of international and national NGOs who are supporting the Rohingya camps. And also, we found that the local NGOs are also competing to retain their staff. In the sustainability context, we consider that this program must be continued because it is highly relevant for the survival of the Rohingya people living in refugee camps. Next, please. So this is my last slide. So recommendation in the context, we found that for Rohingya refugee crisis, triple Nexus approach, which aligned with development effectiveness principle, should be the central operational framework. And we also consider that Sustainable Development Goal 16 should be considered as a nexus enabler in protracted refugee crisis. And peace building must be part of the ongoing Nexus program for improving refugee-host relationship. And the local NGOs should be the key Nexus partner for refugee-host relationship building. And finally, the Bangladesh government should uphold ownership of the Nexus program with the triple Nexus approach to address the Rohingya refugee crisis. At the same time, the international community, both donors and civil society organizations, should pressure the Myanmar government to create an enabling environment for safe and dignified return of the Rohingyas. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Masum. So Leo, you have 5 minutes. Leo, you may unmute. Start your video.
Hi, everyone. I hope I'm clear now.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, great. Our paper is examining the effectiveness of humanitarian development and peace nexus in the Lake Chad region. The Lake Chad region covers 3 of 4 countries: Nigeria, Chad, Niger, and Cameroon. And over the years, because of the Lake Chad itself started shrinking, a lot of conflicts been happening around the Lake Chad. And the region is today home to one of the deadliest terrorist organizations, Boko Haram, which has been responsible for the death of over 100,000 persons from around the region, and has also led to the displacement of some 17 million people from their various places of abode and their livelihoods. Today, too, we have close to 2.4 million IDPs, people living in displaced settlements scattered around the Lake Chad region. So that in itself has thrown up a huge humanitarian problem, one of the largest in the world today. And so this paper is focusing on the role of the United Nations Office of the Office for Humanitarian Assistance coordination in the whole of the 4 countries, the whole of the region. And this is supported by a number of donors from Germany, from Finland, Japan, and a whole lot of others. They've had some meetings between the 2017 and 2018 to look at the humanitarian crisis in the region. So by 2017, yes, they agreed for that intervention, that the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance is coordinating in the region. This is also led by the government. So a whole lot of action is involved, both the country at the national level, at the regional level, as well as the global level. So all of this intervention has been happening for over 13 years, but this paper is focusing on the UN OCHA role, which has been in the past 4, 5, 6 years. So what does this case study say about the triple nexus? Essentially, several experts have argued that the nexus approach is good in the region, as it has the potential to provide better coordination for humanitarian assistance, development support, as well as peace efforts, continuously with increasing intensity. In terms of recommendations for the triple nexus, there is the need for investment in enabling conditions for a more cohesive, comprehensive and cohesive response in the region, as well as resourcing country teams. There is the need for continuous provision of equipment, funding as well. These funds can hardly be enough for the kind of humanitarian crisis that is happening in the region. Also, funding workloads, which is associated with coordination, needs to be given some greater attention going forward. What are the possible actions that need to be done to address the root causes of conflicts in the Lake Chad region? For us, the project looks at the need to continue to save lives by providing timely and integrated multi-sector action and protection of interventions, particularly to the most vulnerable people. The kind of conflict we experience in the Lake Chad region is such that it's one that people really have hardly experienced in other parts of the world, because the actors, the Boko Haram terrorists themselves, they have very little value for human life. People are taken into forests, and even their throats are slit in the forest. Some are taken into captivity, and after several months before they are released, maybe after paying ransom, and so on and so forth. So what is key is how to at least save lives of people living around the Lake Chad. The other is the need for to enhancing timely, unhindered, and equitable access to the multi-sector assistance that is happening in the region, and protection of interventions through principled humanitarian actions. I've had calls in the past where even people that are involved in humanitarian work are even attacked by the terrorists themselves. They even go to attack people who are even in IDP camps. It's as bad as that. And then strengthening the resilience of affected populations to promote recovery and voluntary and safe, durable solutions to displacements and support social cohesion.
Sorry to interrupt, Leo. 1 minute remaining, please. Thank you.
How is UNOCHA helping to achieve this sector objective? Of course, our evaluation covered the period of 2014 to 2021. The program is also helping to address the humanitarian needs of the populations that are affected. Examples between 2016 and 2018, some 1.6 million people have returned or even close to returning to their homes, as well as adapting some kind of regional and cross-border approaches in the region, proven to be helpful in areas of prioritization and harmonization approach. Lastly, the UN humanitarian program is also helping to guarantee the rights of millions of the people in the area, such as the right to life, right to education, and other needs. Because over time, some of those educational and social infrastructure have been destroyed by the conflict. Governments have also begun to articulate concrete and measurable collective outcomes that could also be helpful in the region. Development actors have some 3 to 5 years institution of advancement of a 2030 agenda in line with the new way of working. In Nigeria, for instance, we have the Buhari Plan as part of the UNOCHA program, which is coordinating humanitarian action with recovery and economic development, operationalizing the new way of working in northeastern Nigeria. I thank you for your attention.
All right. Thank you, Masum and Leo. The issues of humanitarian action, especially for the displaced and the refugees, indeed present thought-provoking cases for the triple nexus discourse. On one hand, it is a matter of meeting humanitarian needs, and on the other, it is working on peace building between hosts and refugees, but also peace building in the home countries of the refugees that require a deeper conflict resolution, a more comprehensive conflict resolution. So moving on to our last set of speakers, they're actually our reactors, our two guest reactors, to give a brief response to the presentations. First, we'll be listening to Julia Codina Sarrios, Junior Policy Analyst at the OECD Crisis and Fragility Team, where she works on the Humanitarian Development and Peace Nexus with the International Network on Conflict and Fragility. And then following her is Karina Staibano from the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, where she is one of the lead experts on the triple nexus approach. So Julia, you may take the floor.
Thank you so much, Diwa. First of all, it's a bit hard to react to so many interesting things that have been said and so many different topics that have been covered. Thankfully, I've taken notes, so I will try to address it by order a bit. I thought it was really interesting regarding the first panel when we were talking about basically the gender approach in Nexus and gender mainstreaming within humanitarian development work, especially during the first presentation by Rosa, where she talked about, a feminist approach in women's rights and in order to ensure girls' rights in this type of situations, because it resonated really with the main messages from a paper that we recently produced about gender across the nexus, such as that there's a need for further collaboration and joint planning between what it's normally called the Women, Peace and Security agenda and the Nexus agenda. And especially basically I need to strengthen the messaging on the contribution of gender sensitivity that gender sensitivity can make to the ambition of the Nexus approach itself. There's also, it resonated as well, a lot of things that had been said in that panel of another identified message that was that there's a need for a joint analysis on how gender is influencing each context on which programs are going to be conducted in, regarding fragility, conflict dynamics, because as we know, gender inequalities are one of the main drivers of fragility all around the world. But it has been found that the current analytical tools are still not effective in bringing gender and conflict and fragility aspects into one framework. So this is something, of course, that needs to be more worked on and improved. And there's room for further guidance on what joint gender sensitive analysis can look like. It's also important, I think it was mentioned, one of the last two presentations of the first panel, the role of not only women, but also men. One of the other messages that we found in this report is that there needs to be more attention paid to the role of men and masculinities, because nowadays is still quite limited. And as we know, there's a link between types of masculinities and forms of violence. And also societal expectations on men are basic if we want to transform gender relations and therefore address gender inequality, which in turn is a driver for fragility and one of the main areas of action of the HDP Nexus. And related to this, it's not only gender, of course. One of the findings that we're finding in the OECD research around the HDP Nexus is the Nexus is an opportunity to look and implement thematic areas in an integrative ways. What does it mean? For not having gender climate as standalone issues, but to articulate linkages, priorities, and connections that relate to the leave no one behind agenda, of course, in a context-specific way, but not to have it as separate, siloed entities or approaches that don't feed into each other because they reinforce actually one another. Another reaction that I have is that there was a comment about how coordination in many times is weak. And yes, indeed, it's one of the weakest points that we have currently around the Nexus, especially with the donor side. And also that there's also the need to engage with national leadership and in a context-specific way, because its ownership will take different forms. And with this, I am reacting to the Guatemala comment. It needs to be really case by case, but of course, there's more need to engage with the national leadership. And I wanted also to react to I think it was the last presentation on the second panel, that says that this one actually the country teams are not sufficiently empowered, and it's completely true. It's one of the things that we're finding. The Nexus approach and also the new way of working and many other frameworks clearly identify the resident coordinator, for example, of the UN, as a driver to align with the Nexus strategy and approach. But nowadays, there's still not enough resources, be it economic, but also in terms of knowledge and staff preparation and deployment, actual capacities and empowerment of these kind of offices for them to be able to effectively and also learn and move forward. And another point that I wanted to make that maybe it's interesting, and it links many of the topics covered by these different presentations, is that as we move forward, we do really need to think ways to monitor and evaluate the success against the Nexus recommendation or Nexus approach, to establish collective outcomes, but also to evaluate the collective advancement into implementing this Nexus, in order to also be accountable, of course, for the populations that are recipients of aid or many other actors. It needs to be evaluated, and it's something that is starting to emerge, especially with UN agencies and specific donors, like, for example, SEED and so on. But it's still really, really incipient yet. And with this, I finish. And I thank you for your very interesting presentations. And I give the word to Karina.
Okay, thank you so much, all the researchers, and thank you so much for your presentations. And thank you, Julia. I think listening to you, we are in harmony when it comes to our reactions and conclusions. But I will also try and give you some more maybe general comments or reactions to these very rich and insightful presentations. Again, thank you very much. I just would like to start by saying that SIDA and Sweden, I represent Sweden working in SIDA, we very much welcome the DAC recommendation on the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus. We think it's really, it's a solid common framework for all the three pillars to be able to take this work forward. And in SIDA, we have worked proactively in context with humanitarian and development support to create these connections across the HDP nexus, again, depending on context and opportunities. And last year, we also went a step further when we drafted an internal nexus guidance for SIDA to better do these linkages between policy level and being more based on our concrete experience working in our countries with our development partners and humanitarian colleagues. And we realized that we had to do this because we had some very good examples of doing this work in the field, on the ground, in our context, when it comes to how we plan and analyze and do programming. But we had a weak policy guidance or a weak policy link saying that this is important, and also explaining what we mean with the HDP nexus in SIDA. So, I just want to emphasize this, that because I believe this also resonates quite well with many of your conclusions in this in the report, that the HDP Nexus approach needs to be understood in order to be implemented. It sounds very basic, but we have really felt this in SIDA, that it's very key to do this. And again, I think all the cases you have presented include really a wide array of different cases in different contexts. And one aspect that I was thinking about that is very clear when listening to you is that when we talk about the relevance of an HDP Nexus approach or different HDP Nexus approaches, we're talking about contexts with huge challenges, as many of you pointed out, often ridden by a multitude of different crises, man-made or natural, as well as serious governance and equity issues, and often these are very protracted in the sense that they have been taking place under a long duration of time. And this is both a challenge, a huge challenge, but it's also the main opportunity when we talk about the HDP Nexus. We have no choice then to make as much as possible out of limited international resources in these contexts. And we need to use a Nexus approach to do this. And we know very well, I mean, working on the Nexus at a policy level, that it's not easy. We still have some grounds to cover, but there's no alternative than to collaborate and increase this coherence and complementarity. So the first point, or the second point, is actually to emphasize the relevance of the context and the specific conditions on the ground, which you have shown, for any success of any approaches to increase this coherence between humanitarian development and peace efforts. And as you so rightly point out in your paper, the level of activity or involvement of the state or in the conflict becomes directly relevant for any design of any HDP Nexus approaches. What also influences, of course, as you also pointed out, is the level of international involvement, the presence of donors, development donors, the role and politics of the host state, of course, like in the case of Bangladesh, and of course also the underlying root causes of the crisis and the conflict. So what we're learning here is that what's possible in one context might not be possible in another. We could just compare Bangladesh with Uganda a couple of years ago, at least in Uganda. So the context is really key. Any HDP Nexus approaches must be based on the needs of the people at risk and the specificities of the context. And I think your case studies are insightful examples of this. My second point I'd like to make is just what you all have touched upon, the necessity to do solid and joint conflict sensitivity analysis and the relevance of addressing the root causes of the crisis or conflict And we see the aspect of undertaking joint and shared, joint or shared. I say shared because I think that's what we're aiming for. Joint or shared conflict analysis is an important feature of the peace element of the HDP Nexus. And in SIDA, we have really tried to focus on this. And for us, it's mandatory in all contexts where we are with development cooperation to do this conflict sensitivity analysis. And we also see the need for shared country or context-specific analysis based on risk and vulnerability, aiming to build resilience in fragile contexts. And again, many of your cases really point in this direction that this needs to be undertaken. So because if we do not understand or have a common understanding of the main issues in this specific context and a way to address these, we will not be able to work at all through a Nexus approach. But there are some obstacles also that hinder this, or I'd just like to raise one because I am looking at the time now, so I will just quickly raise the element of coordination. I think it has been mentioned by many of you and also by Julia. it's very key, the coordination, and we are seeing that it's, as a donor, it's weak on the development side among donors, also in relation to the host government, and the coordination structure on the humanitarian side is much stronger and much more structured. However, it's still very closed and not intended for Nexus coordination. So this is something we need to address jointly, and which is also being addressed through INCAF. And also another fact that donors are now, I think, focusing more on the internal coordination, because we need to get our own house in order before we can engage in a coordinated manner in the countries. But this has also led to the effect that we are a bit lagging behind. So this is also a point I'd like to raise, which is also in your research. I'm actually going to stop there because I'm looking at the time. I just want to thank you again for this impressive report and insightful case studies. And I think the way you're doing this, to share good examples and challenges and obstacles by illustrating through case studies, I think that's an excellent way of learning. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia and Karina. So at this point, before we take a break with the video, we can open the mic for people who would like to raise questions to both our research contributors and also to our reactors. So you could just raise your hand so we can acknowledge you, and you can open your mic and video if you would like to intervene. For now, we have one comment in the chat in relation to spaces for engagement, which we can participate in. So there are varying issues as suggested in the thematic focuses of the research that can be entry points for the triple nexus. And the question is, can there be certain specific recommendations that can be sent to, for example, UNFCCC or the upcoming COP26 meeting, wherein we can input the policy recommendations as discussed in the researches? So that is one. Basically, the question is areas for engagements that we can participate in. So our reactors can answer that, respond to that, but also our research contributors who are currently engaged in platforms, multi-stakeholder platforms that we can participate in. You can also open your mic and videos so that we can see each other. Okay, so is there anyone who is interested in answering or raising a question, another question? Okay, I know for a fact that the global people, the UNFSS is coming up, the Food Systems Summit, and there have been topics on food security amid conflict, and that, I think that's a very good entry point for the Nexus discourse, because it talks about peace but also development in terms of self-reliance on the food systems and production of the peoples in situations of conflict and occupation. So that could be one space. And of course the COP, as already mentioned in the comment, could be space for climate-related thematic issues. And then the annual business and human rights of the UN is a space for indigenous peoples facing issues on extractives, as mentioned in the Guatemala and Philippine case. Luis, would you like to add?
Sí, gracias. Quisiera hacer un aporte.
I would like to now say something regarding the importance
en los procesos de cooperación,
to the accountability in development processes, and how does this impact corruption in efficiency, in help efficiency, and in development processes, Guatemala is a clear example of a weak state because of corruption, and it's also reflected in the impact that it has in development policies and in specific projects. And lastly, I would like to mention the importance of global cooperation to improve the humanitarian help resource, and this communications global space in which we are, the civil society organizations. And I would like to thank to everyone that is making the effort in order to improve the capacities and accountability in our governments and in our countries. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luis. We have one question addressed to our reactors from Julia and Karina. How are the discussions about the triple nexus faring? It is a relatively new idea that gained currency shortly before the COVID-19 pandemic. Are people at the UN or the OECD still talking about it?
Hi, if I may react to this. Yes, indeed. I think I would structure my answer in two parts. It is true that the concept itself of the triple nexus is not that old, but there were initiatives and ideas and discussions before, for example, the DAC recommendation that precede this recommendation. And I'm not only talking about the new way of working, but of course, during the 90s, the Humanitarian Development Nexus and the need to incorporate resilience into programming. There has been already, I would say that the DAC recommendation is actually the result of many other discussions from the wide, the different types of actors. On the second part of if it still has momentum within the UN and within the OECD, I would say that yes, actually, we've seen a growth in number of adherents to the recommendation since it was published. I've seen that 3 other UN agencies have adhered since the very beginning. We are, for example, also in talks with the international financing institutions, such as the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and such, which are slowly but surely trying to incorporate certain parts of the Nexus approach into their own programming and analysis. Of course, it always has to be according to everyone's mandate. It doesn't have to be that there's no one very big toolbox to apply the Nexus approach, but it does have a momentum. Talking, for example, about DAC donors from the OECD, we've seen many initiatives ranging from new types of policies, creating instruments within their ministries, new ways of funding as well, new types of units. For example, now that Karina is here, SIDA has, for example, the Nexus advisors, which is trained staff. So, and not only Sweden, but we can talk about Japan and the US with, I do think it does have a momentum, especially now, of course, after, well, not hopefully it will be after soon, but during and after the COVID pandemic, we've seen the need to really be more coherent and collaborative in our responses, because it's a moment in time that resources, there are not that plenty, and there's a very big emergency. So of course, this has, I would say, put more emphasis in this kind of approach in order to make sure, and also we've seen also, I think, with COVID and how it has related with fragile context and conflict affected context, that it's not continuum. It's not humanitarian development and then peace building work. Normally, the three of them have to be together in many, many contexts. And of course, the need for a context-specific approach in many other instances. So I would say that, yes, indeed, there is momentum, and within also the UN organizations are creating more partnerships. They are reaching out to for example, not only working between them, but for example, the World Bank has expanded its partnerships in working with the UN further from traditional governmental actors. It has worked with the ICRC. So slowly but surely, everyone is kind of incorporating at its own pace elements to be more nexusy, if you will. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Would anyone like to add to the questions or give an intervention? Otherwise, we will be proceeding to showing a video as a summary of the research, and then followed by a short survey, and then we will synthesize the whole presentation and the discussions. All right. Thank you, Blaise.
Prolonged conflicts, exacerbated fragility, and an increase in conflicts in the world call for greater humanitarian assistance. As a response to this situation, the Triple Nexus discourse was adopted at the top levels of the United Nations around the year 2016. Triple Nexus refers to the interlinkages across humanitarian development and peace actions and aims to strengthen the collaboration, coherence, and complementarity among the three pillars. The main idea is that efforts to address the causes of conflicts and states of fragility should go hand in hand with immediate and short-term responses. Development and peace actions should accompany humanitarian actions. The Nexus approach is envisioned to be a context-specific solution driven by on-ground needs, as opposed to simply implementing pre-existing frameworks. In Localizing the Triple Nexus, a policy research on the humanitarian development and peace nexus in 9 contexts, a research compilation published by the CSO Partnership for Development Effectiveness, Reality of Aid Asia Pacific, and the Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation. The development effectiveness of programs implemented in 9 countries were evaluated in relation to the Triple Nexus approach: Syria, Bangladesh, Lake Chad region, Cameroon, Mozambique, Afghanistan, Mali, Guatemala, and the Philippines. The research is an effort to illustrate the realities in the implementation of the Triple Nexus on the ground regarding its ability to address the root causes of conflict while upholding human rights obligations. All these case studies, in varying degrees, support the Triple Nexus's emphasis on the need for people-centered development actions in situations of conflict and fragility. Many of these case studies show the following: low level of awareness of the Triple Nexus discourse, both on the part of governments and CSOs. Problems in the delivery of humanitarian aid, difference between pledges, let alone needs, and actual delivery, and predictability in timing. Lack of priority for actions against gender-based violence. Lack of inclusive partnerships, especially in relation to CSOs, affecting and implying lack of transparency and accountability. Lack of country ownership, or the huge role of donor interests. Funding is still within the disconnected pillars of the Triple Nexus, not for the entire program. Differences in funding timelines of humanitarian actions on the one hand and development and peace actions on the other. The peace component is missing in either or both policy and implementation. If present, peace building is defined as mere absence of armed conflict, with little to no regard to addressing the root cause of conflict. Problems on the reporting of collective outcomes. As political and economic crises result in the escalation of conflict, fragility, climate and health emergencies, and inequalities, the triple nexus is an urgent field of study as nothing less than human lives and the environment are at stake. Localizing the Nexus approach is helpful and necessary in order to reap meaningful perspectives on humanitarian development and peace actions toward rights-based, people-centered, and sustainable development. And the critical shift, admittedly long-term, from humanitarian assistance delivery to ending the need for it. In many case studies, political decisions that lie outside the purview of the triple nexus must be made for the recommendations forwarded by the research papers to be carried out. Despite this, the triple nexus provides a policy discourse that can contribute to the making of such political decisions, particularly in convincing or putting pressure on various stakeholders. When these political decisions favoring the recommendations are made, the triple nexus can be instrumental in minimizing the harmful effects of conflicts, addressing their root causes, and facilitating principled resolutions.
and peace programs in the respective contexts, and the potentials of its effectiveness if these were to adopt the appropriate Nexus approach. In the studies, it also showed how all actors across all pillars agree that working in situations of conflict and fragility would mean eventually having to identify and address the roots. However, when it comes to the actual views and analysis of the roots, that's where the differences may show. So even we agree that there should be a nexus, but when it comes to defining what peace building means, what development is, or even humanitarian, there are still differing views, especially for the side of civil society and for government, and at times a bigger part of the private sector, which is the multinational corporations that have different concepts of development. So for instance, on the side of peace, it may mean engaging in militaristic solutions, securitized responses to crisis when it comes to peacekeeping for the states. But for civil society, this means the absence of those kinds of responses, and actually the need to counter those kinds of responses. And in relation to the development partnerships, which is one of the key advocacies of the CPDE, development partnerships play a big role in operationalizing Triple Nexus. One, because it speaks of coherence and collaboration among development actors across a multi-stakeholder platform. But on the other hand, we also recognize that we do not promote partnership for the sake of partnership or cooperation itself. So cooperation is also based on the same pillars of how we define peace, development, and the long-term concept of people-centered and sustainable development, and peace that lasts, and not just the absence of short-term violence. So we've also heard from the reactors, the current conversations that are going on in the side of the donors, that it is in fact the Triple Nexus remains relevant in the aid discourse, and there are spaces that we could engage in further to forward the messages, the key messages from the ground that have been presented in the studies. So with that, I think I will give the mic back to Sarah to have the final wrap up and to extract the key messages, which now become our advocacy calls for this closing segment of the program.
Yes, thank you so much, Diwa, and apologies for our delay, but we hope you can still stay for another 5 minutes. So we've had a very productive launch. There's too much information, so we hope the video that we just shown you help in the synthesis of the highlights and recommendations of the launch. But of course, we will send you the link of our research, no? And we will also circulate this among our networks. And of course, we'll also post the video online. But for now, so as I've put it on the chat box, we have these advocacy posters. Before we do the closing remarks by Philak, he's already around. We hope you can use the advocacy posters as background, or you've printed it out, or you can save it on your phone and show it. So we have this photo up. So these posters or serve as our key messages, no? That CSOs can also use, you know, when they draft their own engagement plans out of this research. So I have here, of course, it's mirrored, but this is about peace. No? Others are on development aid, militarization, gender and climate, people-centered development, and against attacks to civil society. So let's just give 2 seconds for the rest. And tech team, please be ready with the screenshot. I'll also do it on my end. Thank you to those who have printed or used it on your background. We can also send this out after. So you can also use this in your own campaigns in the future, or you can post it online too. All right, so just one and the count of three. 1, 2, 3. Smile. All right. Okay, one more, please. Thank you. Okay, so are the photos all right? Should we have one more? All right, thank you so much. I now turn over the floor to Silak, the CPDE Asia outgoing focal person for final remarks before we finally end our launch. Silak, over to you. Yes, there. Is Tilak here? I couldn't hear him. Okay. Okay, I think we missed Tilak. Internet problems, most likely. But again, thank you so much for attending our launch, and we will be sending you post launch materials. Thank you to all our contributors and to our reactors, and to all the organizers of this launch. Finally, we're able to finish it. But there's still so much to do when it comes to our Nexus work. Now, the engagement just starts here. Now that we have this research, we can use it to further inform our policy advocacy initiatives. The research will also be available in Spanish, French, and Arabic. So please watch out for that. And we hope you can distribute or circulate it in your own countries. So thank you so much, and good night from Manila.